The red and blue lights painted the front of my house like a twisted 4th of July show, strobing patterns across white siding that my father had installed 40 years ago with pride and precision. I stood there in my worn work boots and faded jeans, my county deputy's badge glinting under the harsh LED spotlight of the patrol cruiser, watching as Karen Whitmore, our neighborhood's self-proclaimed community president and suburban dictator, shrieked with a particular pitch of someone who'd never been told no and couldn't process the concept. That's him. That's the trespasser. Her voice cracked on the last word, pointing at me with manicured finger that shook with manufactured outrage. He's refusing lawful orders to vacate HOA property. I demand you remove him immediately. The rookie officer couldn't have been more than 25. Still had that fresh academy posture and uncertain expression of someone encountering his first truly complicated domestic situation. Hesitated, looking between Karen's theatrical fury and my calm stance on my own front porch. "Ma'am, this man appears to be—" "I own this property," she interrupted, her voice climbing another octave into territory that would make dogs wince. "This entire street is under HOA jurisdiction. He refuses to comply with community regulations, refuses to pay fines, refuses to leave. Arrest him for criminal trespass, harassment, and threatening a public official." I let her finish her performance, watching the rookie's partner, a more experienced officer named Rodriguez, who I'd worked with on 3 different cases over the past decade, suppressing what looked like either a smile or a grimace. The flashing lights created shadows that danced across my driveway where my truck sat parked, the same driveway that had existed since 1979, long before Karen's HOA or her manufacturer authority. Finally, when she paused for breath and the dramatic effect she clearly expected, I pulled my credentials from my jacket pocket with deliberate slowness. The leather wallet flipped open to reveal my county deputy's shield, my identification card with my photo and signature, and the authority that came with 20 years of law enforcement service, including 12 years as an Air Force criminal investigator before that. "Actually," I said, keeping my tone calm but cold enough to frost the summer evening air, "I'm the one making the arrest tonight. Not for trespass, for fraud, embezzlement, filing false police reports, and conspiracy to commit extortion under color of authority." The rookie's eyes went wide. Rodriguez's hand moved instinctively to his radio, calling for backup without being asked. And Karen's face. Oh, her face went through a spectrum of emotions faster than a slot machine. Confusion, disbelief, panic, and finally that particular pale shade of terror that comes when someone realizes their criminal enterprise just collapsed. I stepped off my porch, pulling my own handcuffs from my belt with the practiced motion of someone who'd done this hundreds of times, and began reading her the Miranda rights in the clear, formal tone required by law and departmental procedure. "Karen Whitmore, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights as I've explained them to you?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air, no sound emerging for several seconds before she found her voice. Or rather, found a shrill parody of her usual commanding tone. You can't do this. I'm calling my lawyer. This is harassment. Police brutality. I'm a respected community leader. I have connections." "Good," I replied, clicking the handcuffs closed around her wrists while Rodriguez moved to prevent any interference from her husband, who'd emerged from her Lexus, looking ready to escalate things physically. "You're definitely going to need that lawyer. You have about 7 felony charges waiting for you, and those connections you mentioned, several of them are going to be co-defendants." The metallic click of the cuffs, the crackle of police radios calling for additional units, the smell of summer evening mixed with hot asphalt, and Karen's expensive perfume that couldn't mask the scent of panic sweat. All of it crystallized into the moment I've been building toward for 6 months of investigation, harassment, and documentation. You're probably wondering how we got here. How a simple neighborhood dispute about a fence turned into a multi-agency criminal investigation, ending with a felony arrest on a quiet suburban street, where the biggest excitement was usually someone's dog getting loose. Let me rewind and tell you exactly how this started, and how one woman's obsession with control led her to commit federal crimes against a deputy sheriff who happened to specialize in exactly the kind of fraud she was running. My name's Daniel Mercer, 42 years old, And for the past 2 decades, I've worn a badge in one form or another. First, as an Air Force Office of Special Investigations criminal investigator tracking fraud, theft, and corruption within military installations. Then as a county deputy sheriff specializing in property crimes, insurance fraud, and financial investigations that require more patience than excitement. I'd spent most of my career in the weeds of complex cases. Contractors defrauding the military by billing for work never performed. Insurance scams where people burned their own properties for payouts. Real estate schemes that left elderly victims homeless. The kind of work that requires reading thousands of financial documents, building cases that could withstand aggressive defense attorneys, and a particular satisfaction that comes from putting white-collar criminals in prison where they belonged. After 20 years of this work, 12 in military investigations where I'd earned commendations for cases that saved taxpayers millions, 8 more as a civilian deputy building a reputation for thorough documentation and successful prosecutions. I wanted something simpler, something that didn't involve constant travel, endless paperwork, and the burnout that comes from seeing humanity's creative approaches to theft and fraud. My late father's old home in Maple Creek Estates seemed perfect for that transition. The property had been in our family since 1974, purchased by my father, Robert Mercer, after he returned from Vietnam, and wanted a place where the American dream he'd fought for could actually exist. He called it Mercer Acres despite it being just a single residential lot, a modest 3-bedroom ranch house on half an acre, with an oak tree in the backyard that was older than the town itself. Dad had been a machinist, a craftsman who believed in building things properly the first time, maintaining them religiously, and taking pride in work well done. The fence he'd built around the property in 1979 was constructed from pressure-treated posts and cedar rails that would outlast most modern materials. The workshop he constructed in the garage was organized with the precision of someone who understood that proper tools and proper maintenance meant the difference between quality work and dangerous shortcuts. When he passed 3 years ago from complications of Agent Orange exposure, a slow death that gave us time to say everything that needed saying, but not enough time for everything we wanted to do together. He left me the house, the workshop. Mr. Mercer, I've been president of this HOA for 8 years. I've successfully brought dozens of non-compliant properties into proper standing. Trust me when I say that resistance is both futile and expensive. You'll either comply voluntarily or we'll make compliance so costly and stressful that you'll beg to pay the fines just to make it stop. She turned on her expensive heels and walked back to her idling Lexus with the confidence of someone who delivered the same speech before, who'd watched other homeowners crumble under pressure, who genuinely believed her manufactured authority was untouchable. By sunset, there was a violation notice taped to my front door, the same notice she'd handed me, now formally served with a sticker showing date and time, signed by K. Whitmore, HOA president, with flourishes that suggested her signature carried the weight of actual law. That was day one of what would become a 6-month war between suburban tyranny and actual justice. Karen had picked her target based on an assumption that had served her well before, that most people would rather pay than fight. She didn't know she'd just declared war on a deputy sheriff who specialized in exactly the kind of fraud she was running, who had the patience to build airtight cases, and who had absolutely nothing to lose by fighting back with every tool 20 years of law enforcement had given him. Within a week, my mailbox contained a stack of violation notices thick enough to qualify as a case file in any fraud investigation I'd ever worked. Each one was printed on official-looking HOA letterhead, complete with case numbers, legal-sounding reference codes, and escalating fine amounts that would have bankrupted most homeowners through sheer volume even if the individual charges were manageable. $250 for improper vehicle storage because my work truck, a 10-year-old Ford F-150 that I use for hauling lumber and tools, was parked in my own driveway rather than inside my garage. Apparently, the HOA's architectural guidelines required all vehicles to be garaged overnight to maintain visual harmony and property values. $375 for unauthorized noise disturbance during restricted hours because I'd run my table saw at 10:30 a.m. on a Saturday morning while building a bookshelf in my workshop. The citation claimed that power tool usage was prohibited before noon on weekends, referencing a bylaw that didn't actually exist in any of the HOA's file documents. $500 for unapproved exterior modifications because I'd replace a broken porch light with an identical fixture purchased from the same manufacturer. According to Karen's interpretation of the rules, any exterior change, no matter how minor or how identical to the original, required prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee, a 3-week review process, and a $150 application fee. $600 for landscape maintenance deficiency because I had dandelions in my lawn, not an overgrown yard, not dead grass, not any actual maintenance issue, just the natural presence of common weeds that literally every lawn in the neighborhood had, but which Karen had decided to cite on my property specifically. But the paper warfare was just the opening salvo. Karen escalated to physical intimidation with the sophistication of someone who clearly weaponized HOA authority before and knew exactly which tactics broke people's will to resist. She assembled what she called her compliance team. 3 retirees with too much time and too little purpose who'd found meaning in Karen's crusade against non-compliant properties. They started patrolling past my house multiple times daily, always carrying cameras around their necks like paparazzi stalking celebrities, photographing every aspect of my property from the public sidewalk, and sometimes from angles that suggested they were trespassing to get better shots. One morning around 7 a.m., I was in my garage workshop sorting through my father's vintage hand tools when I noticed movement outside. One of Karen's compliance team members, a man in his 70s wearing a bright orange safety vest like he was conducting official municipal business, was leaning over my fence, extending his phone camera through the gap, photographing the interior of my garage and workshop. I walked out calmly, making sure my county deputy's badge was visible on my belt. "Excuse me, sir," I called out in my professional law enforcement voice, calm, clear, carrying authority without aggression. "You're currently trespassing on private property. I'm going to need you to step back onto the public sidewalk immediately." He stammered, nearly dropping his phone in surprise at being confronted, his face flushing red with either embarrassment or anger. Karen said we were allowed to document violations from any vantage point necessary for proper enforcement. She said we had authorization. "She's not the law." I interrupted, my tone hardening slightly. "And neither are you. You're currently committing criminal trespass under Colorado Revised Statutes 18-4-504. I'm a county deputy sheriff, and I'm ordering you to leave this property immediately. If you refuse, I will arrest you. If you return without permission, I will arrest you. Do you understand?" He retreated quickly, muttering about harassment and abuse of authority, pulling out his phone to presumably call Karen and report that her intimidation campaign had hit an obstacle. But the encounter told me everything I needed to know. Karen had convinced her followers that they were operating under some kind of official authority, that HOA business justified actions that would otherwise be criminal, and that most homeowners wouldn't know enough law to challenge them. The next day, my mailbox was stuffed with anonymous letters, printed on plain paper, no signatures, no return addresses, delivered during the night when cameras and witnesses were scarce. "Leave if you know what's good for you. People who fight the HOA always lose. Your father will be ashamed of what you're doing to his property. Accidents happen to people who don't cooperate. The last one, the one threatening vague accidents, crossed from harassment into territory that any reasonable prosecutor would consider intimidation and possibly conspiracy to commit assault." I photographed each letter, documented the dates and times I'd found them, and filed them in what was becoming a comprehensive evidence folder, because that's when I realized with absolute clarity what I was dealing with. This wasn't about a fence, wasn't about truck parking or table saw noise or dandelions in the lawn. This was about control, about a woman who discovered that HOA authority could be weaponized against people who didn't know their rights, who'd built a system of harassment and intimidation that generated compliance through exhaustion and fear, and who'd probably been running the scam successfully for years against homeowners who couldn't fight back. The investigator in me, the part that spent 20 years tracking fraud and building cases against people who thought they were too smart or too connected to face consequences, recognized the pattern immediately, said, "But then I saw her compliance team trespassing on your property to take photos. That's not what law-abiding people do. What can I do to help?" Even some of Karen's former supporters were getting nervous. The dramatic escalation of dues without visible improvements, the constant violations against properties that look fine, the aggressive harassment tactics that felt more like organized crime than community governance. It was starting to crack the facade of legitimacy Karen had built. Karen had tried to divide and conquer, to isolate me into helpless surrender, but she'd underestimated how many people she'd already victimized, how much resentment had been building beneath the surface compliance, and how quickly her empire could crack once someone demonstrated that fighting back was possible. The community was dividing, yes, but not in the way Karen expected. The division was becoming those afraid to challenge her versus those ready to fight back. And the second group was growing every day. Time to turn that division into an organized resistance. Karen went for the jugular with the calculated precision of someone who'd weaponized bureaucracy before and knew exactly which government agencies could be manipulated into doing her dirty work through strategic filing of false complaints. The first assault came through the county zoning office. I received an official notice that my property was under investigation for operating an unlicensed commercial workshop in a residential zone. The complaint, filed anonymously but obviously orchestrated by Karen, claimed I was running a furniture manufacturing business, selling products for profit, generating commercial traffic, and violating zoning regulations that prohibited business operations in residential neighborhoods. The zoning inspector who showed up was apologetic, but obligated to investigate. "Mr. Mercer, I've got to follow up on complaints even when they're obviously frivolous," he said, looking around my garage workshop where my father's vintage hand tools hung organized on pegboard walls. "You're clearly not running a commercial operation here. This is a hobby workshop, and even the furniture you've donated to charity wouldn't qualify as commercial activity. But I still have to file a report, and the complaint will stay on your property record even after I clear you." 2 weeks later, another anonymous complaint. Toxic materials being stored and disposed of improperly, creating environmental hazards and groundwater contamination risks. This one triggered a visit from the county environmental health department, requiring me to take a day off work to meet with inspectors who examined my property and found nothing more dangerous than with stain, motor oil for my truck, and paint supplies that were properly stored and labeled. Whoever's filing these complaints is wasting county resources, the environmental inspector told me, shaking his head with visible frustration. This is the fourth obviously false report we've responded to in this neighborhood this year. Someone's using our office as a harassment tool, and it's going to stop being consequence-free pretty soon. We're starting to track the pattern. Then came the coup de grace. The HOA filed a lien against my property for unpaid dues and accumulated fines, totaling $7,200. The lien was filed with the county clerk's office, becoming part of my property's public record, affecting my credit, and potentially blocking any future sale or refinancing until resolved. The amount was pure fiction. I had never been a member of the HOA, never owed dues, and the fines were for violations I committed only in Karen's imagination. But liens don't require proof to be filed, just paperwork and filing fees. Removing a fraudulent lien requires legal action, attorney fees, and months of bureaucratic fighting that most homeowners can't afford. Karen understood that the process was a punishment, that even fraudulent legal actions could destroy someone financially and emotionally through the sheer cost and stress of fighting back, regardless of who was ultimately right. She scheduled a mandatory compliance hearing at the HOA Community Center, sending me a formal summons that was designed to look like an actual court order. Your presence is required to address outstanding violations and determine remediation requirements. The notice read, "Failure to appear will result in default judgment and accelerated enforcement actions, including property seizure." Property seizure. She was actually threatening to take my father's house through HOA action, claiming authority she absolutely didn't possess, but betting I wouldn't know enough law to call her bluff. I attended the hearing with a voice recorder in my pocket and a copy of Colorado HOA statutes in my briefcase. The tribunal consisted of Karen and 2 board members sitting at a folding table like judges at trial, with about 15 residents watching from folding chairs arranged courtroom style. Karen opened with theatrical formality. "This hearing is convened to address violations by Daniel Mercer of 437 Oak Street, case number HOA 2023-847. Mr. Mercer has accumulated 17 violations over 4 months, refused all attempts at voluntary compliance, and owes the association $7,200 in fines and fees." The board will hear evidence and determine appropriate remediation. I let her present her case, reading violations from her clipboard, displaying photographs of my fence and truck and workshop, dramatically explaining how my non-compliance threatened property values and community standards. When she finished, I stood calmly and began dismantling her case with the precision of a prosecutor destroying a defendant's alibi. First, this property is not under HOA jurisdiction. The deed predates your incorporation by 30 years and is explicitly grandfathered under Colorado Revised Statutes 38-33.3-106.5. Second, you're citing Municipal Code Section 14 to 237, which was repealed in 2014. Third, your bylaws give you no authority to levy fines exceeding $50 per violation per occurrence, making your $7,200 claim fraudulent. Fourth, this hearing has no legal standing. You're not a court, you're volunteers pretending to be judges. And fifth, everything you've done constitutes harassment, extortion, and abuse of process under Colorado criminal statutes. The room went silent. Karen's face flushed red, her carefully maintained composure cracking. I'm not here to debate law with someone who thinks his badge gives him special treatment, she snapped. The board has authority to interpret and enforce. Within a week, we'd installed covert GPS tracking on the white pickup truck that bore Silverline Property Management decals, legally installed while the vehicle was parked on public streets, tracking its movements 24/7. The data was damning. The truck spent most days parked at Marcus Whitmore's residence, occasionally made runs to big box hardware stores, and frequently visited Karen's house in the evening. But it never went to Maple Creek Estates during business hours. Never performed the landscaping maintenance that the HOA was supposedly paying $7,500 monthly to receive. Never did any of the work that justified $287,000 in payments over 3 years. Ramos set up surveillance cameras near Marcus's house and captured him unloading landscaping supplies from the Silverline truck, supplies purchased with HOA funds, and using them on his own property, theft from his own shell company, stealing from the association twice, once through fraudulent billing, again by keeping the materials. Meanwhile, Sarah subpoenaed financial statements and discovered wire transfers showing the full money trail. HOA payments to Silverline, Silverline transfers to Marcus's personal account, Marcus transfers to Karen's personal account, total amount moved, $163,000 over 2 years. The embezzlement was documented in their own bank records, preserved forever in electronic transactions that couldn't be explained away as bookkeeping errors. We didn't just have a Karen problem anymore. We had a criminal enterprise operating under the cover of suburban governance, and we had evidence strong enough to secure convictions that would send multiple people to prison for years. Now we just needed to make them incriminate themselves on camera. The deeper we dug into Karen's operation, the darker and more extensive the criminal conspiracy became. What had started as investigation into HOA harassment revealed a sophisticated fraud scheme that had been running for years, victimizing dozens of homeowners and stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars through a network of shell companies, fake vendors, and coordinated extortion. Ramos pulled record from the State Bureau of Investigation, showing that Silverline Property Management was just one of 3 shell companies connected to Karen's network. There was also Maple Creek Maintenance Solutions and Community Standards Enforcement LLC, both registered to relatives of Karen or her husband, both receiving regular payments from the HOA for services that were never actually provided. The pattern was sophisticated enough to suggest experience. Karen had clearly done this before, probably in other HOAs, probably in other states, refining her methods each time until she created a nearly perfect embezzlement scheme hidden behind legitimate-looking paperwork. Even worse, her husband Richard Whitmore, a retired sheriff's deputy who left the force 8 years ago under circumstances that suddenly seemed worth investigating, had been using his old credentials and law enforcement connections to intimidate residents into paying bogus fines. Multiple homeowners reported that Richard had appeared at their doors in what looked like an official capacity, implying that HOA violations could lead to criminal charges if not resolved immediately through payment. That's impersonating a peace officer, Ramos said, reviewing witness statements we collected from victimized homeowners. He's been retired for 8 years, has no authority, but he's been flashing his old badge and threatening people with arrest if they don't pay Karen's fake fines. That's a felony, and it's organized extortion under Colorado RICO statutes. This isn't just embezzlement anymore. This is racketeering. Sarah interviewed 17 different homeowners who've been victims of Karen's schemes over the past 3 years. Their stories followed the same pattern with depressing consistency: unexpected violations for minor issues, escalating fines that quickly became unaffordable, threats of liens and property seizure, Richard showing up to explain the legal consequences of noncompliance, and eventually payment of thousands of dollars in fraudulent fines just to make the harassment stop. These are mostly elderly people on fixed incomes, Sarah reported, her voice tight with anger at the scope of victimization. Retirees who can't afford lawyers, who trust authority figures, who believe that HOA officials must be operating legally because why would community volunteers commit crimes? Karen's been systematically targeting the most vulnerable homeowners, the ones least likely to fight back, the ones most likely to pay rather than risk losing their homes. One victim, an 83-year-old widow named Margaretchen, had paid over $12,000 in fines over 2 years for violations that included excessive bird feeder usage, non-regulation mailbox color, and unauthorized holiday decorations extending beyond approved display periods. She depleted her savings paying these fines, believing Karen's threats that failure to comply would result in foreclosure and homelessness. "I didn't know I could fight back," Margaret told us, tears streaming down her weathered face. Karen said the HOA had legal authority, that judges always sided with associations, that I'd lose my house if I didn't pay. "My husband built this house in 1983. I can't lose it. So I paid everything she demanded." The cruelty of it, targeting elderly widows, threatening them with homelessness, stealing their retirement savings, transformed this from a property dispute into something personal. These were my neighbors, my father's generation, people who'd built this community before Karen arrived with her manufactured authority and criminal schemes. I compiled a comprehensive report documenting every aspect of the criminal enterprise, the shell companies and their fake invoices, the embezzlement of $287,000 in HOA funds, the extortion of individual homeowners totaling at least $146,000 in fraudulent fines, Richard's impersonation of a peace officer, the coordinated harassment campaigns, and the systematic targeting of vulnerable victims. Sarah presented the evidence to the Colorado Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division and the State Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit. The response was immediate and serious. We've had other complaints about Karen Whitmore from previous HOAs where she served as president, the SBI investigator told us during an emergency coordination meeting. Nothing ever moved forward because victims were too scared to cooperate and evidence was scattered. You've just given us a comprehensive case with documentation, witnesses, and financial forensics. You may have just blown this wide open. The State Bureau of Investigation authorized a joint operation with the Sheriff's Department, bringing in resources that would have been unavailable for a simple HOA dispute, but were entirely appropriate for a major fraud and extortion case involving multiple victims and hundreds of thousands in stolen funds. They wanted to move carefully, building an airtight case that would survive aggressive defense attorneys and secure convictions on every charge. That meant letting Karen continue operating while under surveillance, documenting additional crimes, and ultimately catching her in circumstances that would demonstrate consciousness of guilt. We need to make her feel confident,